this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. The P-51 Mustang first saw service with the British. From late 1943, it was flying long-range fighter cover on bomber raids deep into Europe. The Mustang was more than a match for the German 109s and the Bucholtz 190s that it would face. The Mustang revolutionised the air war over Germany. Joining me is Chris Buchholtz. Chris is an aviation historian with a prolific body of work. He previously joined me in episode 110 to discuss the P-47 Thunderbolt. His new book, published by Osprey, is P-51B/C Mustang, Northwest Europe, 1943-44. Chris, thanks for joining me. Am I right in saying the Mustang development came out of a British contract from the British Purchasing Commission? Who are they? What's the background to that?
That commission was established by there was people that were sort of handpicked who had business ties, who were British citizens who had business ties in the United States, and so they're basically the British government commissioned these guys to help facilitate the production of things for the British military during the run up to the war. The classic story is the Battle of Britain's going on, the RAFs in need of fighters, and so the request is put out: can North American license build P-40 Warhawks? And the big mythology is North American aviation comes back and says, no, we won't do that because that's not obsolete aircraft, but we can turn out a new fighter for you, a brand new fighter for you in 90 days. Well, that's easy to say when you've been working on it for a while, when you've been working with drawings and design concepts for like a year and some change. They had all the intellectual stuff already in their back pockets. They were still looking for a customer. It was kind of fascinating how resistant the U.S. Army Air Force was to the Mustang, they kind of had to be dragged along by the success of the Mustang 1 in British hands to just keep the lineage going. There you go. That's the 90-day myth. It was actually 116 days before they could roll it out. And the reason being, and this is one of the great things you learn about this, is that human behavior does not necessarily change in times of war. Allison, the engine manufacturer during the V-1710, just couldn't get it together to send an engine to North American to stick in the airplane they were building. So it took all that time for the engine to finally show up. And then it took time to, of course, fit the engine to the aircraft and make sure that the cooling system worked and everything else. So it stretched out to about 116 days. And I think the other thing that was a big stumbling block was they were having a hard time getting magnesium wheels from the contractor. So you had you may have seen a picture of a Mustang sitting on like wooden wheels, which is kind of incongruous.
It's an incredible feat, though, isn't it? 116 days. I mean, even if they had essentially the drawings in place, the British presumably turn up with a spec. I mean, what are the British looking for specifically? Because are they looking for a replacement for the Spitfire or something? Or just a plane, anything?
They're just looking for someone to fill in the blanks, right? They're looking for something to be basically an Army cooperation aircraft. So, a fighter bomber, low altitude ground attack, which, when the Mustang 1 showed up, that is exactly what it was. Low altitude, really effective, very fast at low altitude, very, very maneuverable, certainly more survivable than the P-40. You could operate a Mustang 1 over Northwest Europe. You couldn't operate a P-40 over Northwest Europe. The environment just was not going to tolerate it. So they're building them for the RAF. I believe they started building them with 30 caliber machine guns, and then RAF specs changed, and something emerged. There was an improved version on that I think the U.S. Army Air Force called the P-51A, which was armed with 20 millimeter cannons. And then when the war actually started for the United States in 1941. The Army Air Force started grabbing a lot of aircraft that were earmarked for other countries because our Air Force was not up to snuff. So we grabbed a lot of what we called what were Mustang 1s in RAF parlance, and turned them into P-51s. And the next group was P-51As. And it was not a big number, but it was enough of a number to make people, honestly, on the coast feel better that they were being defended. One of the other aircraft that they took off the assembly lines and took away from foreign orders was the P66 Vanguard, which was a terrible airplane that was I think was slated to go to the Chinese. And there was a squad of them protecting the Bay Area where I live oh boy, we're protected by P66s. We're super secure here. But the Mustang, it actually got over into British hands. They used it. The first operational use of it was around the time of Dieppe. That's where the first victory was scored in the Mustang by an American flying with the RAF, Hollis Hills. And so it had a good life as a low altitude reconnaissance, scouting, Army cooperation aircraft with the RAF. And back in the United States, they were having a hard time keeping fighters on North American's assembly line. The Army Air Force was figuring out ways to screw it up. Basically, they were saying, there was resistance to the aircraft in the U.S. because it was a British airplane, which is completely weird. There was when there was a requirement for an escort aircraft, there were some big wigs in the Army Air Force that were pushing for not a Merlin powered Mustang. That wasn't even a consideration at the time. They were pushing for a thing called the P-75 Eagle, which was this bizarre Eastern aircraft design that had parts from all different airplanes, including a Dauntless and all kinds of strange things. The Fisher Eagle, which never really it didn't succeed at all. It would have been a calamity. Anyway, what was going on behind the scenes were people who were test flying the aircraft for the Army Air Force loved it. People who saw what was possible were pushing for its development. And at a point where they were going to close the Mustang assembly lines and just devote all of North Americans' attention to the B-25, someone came up with the idea, listen, we've got money in the budget for a dive bomber. The dive bomber is really in vogue right now, thanks to the Stuka. And can we create a Mustang dive bomber? And that's what they did, the A-36. They only made about 500 A-36s. They went over and served in Italy when the U.S. finally got engaged, and they did quite well. And the only reason they really left service was because there weren't enough of them. They wore them out in action. But the most important part about the A-36 really is that it was a bridge between those early Allison-powered Mustangs and the P-51B, which was the result of putting the Merlin the Merlin engine on the Mustang, and that was a British idea.
So who's Allison?
Allison is an American engine firm. They built the engine that was the V1710 was their contribution to the war. It was in the P-38. It was in the P-50 or the P-40. It was in a whole assortment of other aircraft. It was our inline engine. The U.S. had a couple of great engines. The V1710, which was a pretty decent engine, but it sort of depended on how it was employed in the aircraft. If you had superchargers like in the P-38, you had a pretty good aircraft on your hands. If you didn't have that supercharger, you had a P-39, which was only so-so. It was only so-so at high altitude, or you had to fly low altitude. The Russians proved you could fly it at low altitude. So we had the V-1710 and we had the R-2800. Those are the two great engines of the war, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800. But we didn't have an engine like the Merlin until the Mustang discussion began. How do we make the Mustang an aircraft that had some legs and had some advantages performance-wise at altitude?
So who made that leap of faith? Was it the Americans or the British suggested the Merlin? Because obviously the Merlin's a British engine. Yeah,
the British made the suggestion. In fact, the British did the work of fitting Merlins to at least one Mustang, which was a very strange-looking Mustang. It was the cooling system was still for the Allison engine, so you had the engine in kind of a weird place in proportion to the aircraft, but it kind of proved it worked. And after that happened, and after they worked out the details of having Packard in the U.S. manufacture Merlin engines under license, they started working in earnest to create a Merlin-powered P-51 variant. It didn't take that long, although there were a lot of little refinements and adjustments they had to make it work on the airframe. I think my favorite one is the scoop under the fuselage where the radiator goes. That position actually offsets its own drag in terms of the amount of air coming out of the back and the way it's compressed. But it wasn't perfected on the P-51A, so they had to make some changes. And one of the great things about that is on the early Merlin-powered Mustangs, just because of the way the aircraft was shaped, when the aircraft went into accelerated to a certain point and the supercharger kicked in, on the very early prototypes, there was a big bang. Something in the chamber did something, and of course it was alarming to the pilots, right? It was just, oh, here comes the enemy, let's accelerate, bang! That's really not what you want to have happen.
Has something fallen off?
Exactly. So what they did is they took one of the prototypes, they brought it out here to California at the Ames Research Facility, which has a huge wind tunnel. It's not it's a big wind tunnel. It's not a huge wind tunnel. So they trimmed the wings off this thing and mounted it in there. They put one technician in the cockpit to to examine the inputs around the airspeed, and they put another technician in the back of the airplane inside the fuselage, watching and trying to figure out what was going on with the chamber, which was a very daring thing to do, because if that aircraft had come loose in the wind tunnel, both those guys would have been in bad shape. I've been in that wind tunnel. When I saw the pictures and heard the story, it was kind of amazing to me. And that's where they solved it. They figured out, here's what's going on. Here's how we can adjust it. Moving the lip a little bit forward and creating a different configuration to the plenum chamber suddenly got rid of that problem. So there are lots of those little problems they had to solve to get the Merlin into the Mustang, since the Mustang was designed for a different engine altogether.
Was the Packard essentially exactly the same as the Merlin, the Packard variant?
It was pretty much the same engine. Initially there were some discrepancies. Packard was really great at mass production. I mean, even better than Rolls-Royce at the time. That said, they weren't turning out as high quality engines at first as Rolls-Royce were, which kind of makes sense. Rolls-Royce was still doing things, they were still a little more handmade than what Packard was doing. However, because the war was on, you want to have a lot of engines, and Packard got its stuff together and started turning out good engines. The other difference between the British Merlins and the American Merlins is, for whatever reason, the plugs on the American Merlins would foul a lot faster than the ones on the British Merlins. So one of the things American ground crews quickly learned to do was to swap plugs with their RAF compatriots nearby who were using Merlin engines, and get rid of all the American parts to put the British plugs in.
Small nuance, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and it makes a lot of difference. Your engine runs smoother for a lot longer, and a lot less time has to be spent replacing plugs and everything else. And honestly, when the P-51B first arrived, there was a lot of work to do on it anyway. So anything you can do to minimize the amount of work we had to do on the plugs was a big plus.
When it comes in, they're putting in the Merlin engine, or the Packard engine. It's coming on stream in sort of numbers. Was it envisaged to be used as a long range fighter, or was that a sort of a secondary consideration that comes later down the line? Yeah,
I think it was initially thought of as just another addition to U.S. Fighter force, but the factors in Europe quickly pushed it into that role as that long range fighter, because as the U.S. Army Air Force tried to push deeper into Germany, the whole theory of the bombers will always get through, which was something that permeated almost all the air forces when the war started, really was unveiled as a complete fraud. The Germans were not stupid. The P-47 had a limited range. That was its Achilles heel throughout the war, was that its range was somewhat limited. And so the Germans figured out, all we've got to do is stage our heavy fighters just beyond the range of the P-47. When the P-47s have to turn and go for home, we can send in anything we want to attack the bomber stream, including lumbering things like Dornier 217s and Ju-88s and Bf-110s with the Werfer-Granate 21 projectile, which is really a Nebelwerfer artillery round adapted to be fired out of a tube on the wings of an aircraft. Now that slowed the attacking aircraft way down, but it had a pretty big punch. I think it had a 500-foot blast radius, and so if you could fire that into the vicinity of a bomber formation, you could get bombers out of position in the formation, and then you can bring in the single engine fighters and attack with a lot less of a risk to the attacking fighters than if you attacked a mass American bomber force. Yeah, the Werfer-Granate was not easy to aim. It was very hard to tell the range on it before it would explode. You have to sort of parallel or you have to get right in behind the stream and subject yourself to a little fire. But lobbing a few into a formation or around a formation could certainly disrupt it, make it hard for them to bomb, and make it hard for them to stay together. And so the Germans just held their fighters back until the American fighters and British fighters, the Spitfire would cover the first part of many missions. After they had to turn for home, then hit them. Why would you expose your fighters to the escorts if you didn't have to? That was the way it was on the Schweinfurt raids in 1943. The U.S. Air Force suffered punishing losses. They just sort of suspended deep penetration raids until I think November 1943. Meanwhile, the Mustang was sort of coming into action. It was the first ones were showing up. The first Merlin-powered ones were showing up in England about the same time. One of the interesting things that you run across in the book is that North American had a labor action. They had a strike that could have potentially had stopped the Mustang from reaching combat for the second Schweinfurt raid.
That's the ball bearing factory, isn't it?
Yep. That's, if you can find somebody to talk about that, that by itself is a fascinating raid. It shows how badly tactics were designed for the bombers, how hard it was to follow a plan, and because what happened was the forces got strung out, and then the Germans could sort of attack them one at a time. The defenses were not overwhelmed because of weather. Weather in England kept the bombers from forming up.
It's interesting, this period, which you sort of drawing out, is how actually multi-layered the German air defence system was. And until we sort of get these long-range fighters, actually, it's much more of an even battle than you might have otherwise have thought, even though we had numbers on our side.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And the Germans were doing a pretty good job of knocking down bombers. Of course, the anti-aircraft network was pretty. The anti-aircraft artillery network was pretty sophisticated, but the fighters were doing a pretty decent job too. One of the things that's kind of amazing to me, in 1944, you may have heard of Big Week, Operation Argument. The whole plan was, let's get the Luftwaffe in the air and destroy it. Let's use the bombers as bait. And people don't seem to realize the Army Air Force lost more airplanes than the Germans did in Big Week. So it accomplished what it was out to do, which was just to weaken the Luftwaffe, but at the same time, the cost they paid was pretty steep. And at the time when the Mustang finally arrived in December, you've got that multi-layered fighter plan for the Germans. Well, you can imagine how the Germans must have felt when they were staging around in their Bf-110s and Ju-88s and Dornier 217s and whatever you had to fire those rockets, those twin-engine fighters, and suddenly a group of single-engine fighters is with the bombers to the last leg of the mission, to the target. The term "easy meat" came up because a Mustang versus a Ju-88, Mustang versus a Dornier 217, or a 110 for sure. Like in the painting in the book, it's not really a fair fight, and it completely exploded the German fighter strategy. At that point, they basically started pulling different aircraft out of the order of battle against the bombers because they just couldn't survive. There's no point in sending up every single Dornier 217 to get this shot down.
Everything with a gun on, put it in the air.
Yeah. I mean, I think at that point the Luftwaffe said, let's just take these twin engine things and devote everything to fighting the RAF at night because we can't survive in the daytime with Mustangs all over the place.
How did the German fighters compare with the 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190? How do they compare with the Mustang? Are they comparably matched machines, or are they getting long in the tooth by sort of 43, 44? Well,
the 109 Gs and Ks were those are pretty amazing aircraft because they were getting long in the tooth as far as aircraft back in that era, right? They the first 109 was flew in 1936, and here it is 8 years later. That's almost unbelievable. But the performance compared to the Mustang was not that different. But the Mustang had some things on the 109 that the 109 couldn't keep up with. It had the ability to use flaps in combat. It could turn inside a 109. It was, I think, speed-wise, it was comparable, but I think it was more maneuverable. One of the modifications they made the P-51B versus the P-51As and earlier was that the ailerons and the elevators had a few more degrees of play to them, so you could actually turn more tightly. You could control the aircraft better. It was more responsive, and the Germans were always messing around with armament for those aircraft and trying to figure out ways that they could make them more powerful, upgun them. That's kind of the 109's downfall, is that there was not much room for growth as far as armament. So yeah, you could stick 20 millimeter cannons and gondolas in the wing, but then you start eroding the performance of the aircraft. And at that point, you sort of play into the hands of the Mustang. The 190 is a great plane at low altitude, below 20,000 feet. So what the Germans would do is they would kind of load the 190s up as the single engine bomber attack aircraft and have them escorted by the 109s. When the 190s got into it with American airplanes, you would read this all the time. American airplane shows up, goes after a 190. The 190 split S's for the deck, which is basically turning over and diving down in a big half a loop, because they want to get into that regime where they're comparable performance-wise. Otherwise, they are going to get chased down by the Mustangs and shot down. The two German aircraft were good in their own regimes, but the Mustang was kind of good across the board. And the other thing that was working against the Luftwaffe, of course, is the fact that their pilot quality was constantly diminishing. They were taking so many losses, and their training program was so poor, they just couldn't make up those losses. I think one of the fascinating things about the war is the psychology of both the German Air Force and the Japanese Air Force, to the same extent, is that people in those air forces saw going back and being a trainer as a sign of weakness, as a sign of, you can't handle being in combat anymore. You're cracked. And so nobody wanted to go back and train new pilots. Thus, people training pilots were people who'd never seen combat, and they didn't have enough fuel to give these guys hours to train. So you had people who didn't get good instruction and didn't have enough practice being thrown up there against an Air Force where, the average American pilot showed up with 200 plus hours under their belts, and it's kind of an unfair fight. And that started to erode the benefits that the 109 possessed versus the American fighters, or the 190 low altitude.
It's funny you should mention the armament, because literally just before we started, I made a note because it popped into my head that I wondered if part of the strength of the Mustang on these long missions was it had one job to take on fighters. Where part of the problem of the Luftwaffe was, what are they taking on? Are they taking on the fighters or the bombers? In which case, what do you arm it with? And if you put this on for the bombers, does that affect its ability to attack the fighter, or do you take on the fighter, which then you can't take on the bomber, and at which point you can't win? You're juggling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they had too many missions, and they didn't have the ability to sort of choose which unit was going to be engaged with what part of the attacking force. Especially after when Jimmy Doolittle took over as head of the 8th Air Force. He said that there's a sign that said, the fighter's job is to protect the bombers. He said, no, tear that down. The fighter's job is to destroy the Luftwaffe. And one of the things that he instituted was the ability for parts of some of the escort groups to range ahead of the bomber stream and hit the German fighters as they were joining up, which was again devastating. These badly trained or poorly trained aviators trying to get their formations together with one or two experienced guys, and suddenly the Mustangs are there already. That really also contributed to the downfall of Luftwaffe. They couldn't do what you just said, Angus. They couldn't get themselves organized to make coherent attacks, and as a result, you had aircraft that were unsuited for attacking certain targets being pressed into service, and you had some attacks where 5 109s go after a bomber stream and 2 Mustangs tack onto them and just pick them off one by one because the guys are just they're too focused on one part of the mission. That's what was evolving. It was a very complex situation for the Luftwaffe, rapidly changing, and they went from being fairly well in control of things to having complete chaos inflicted on them.
We've alluded to the massive range. They had over 700 miles range. How did they achieve that range, which was twice the Thunderbolt's range? It's a tremendous range.
Yeah, it's an incredible distance. Yeah, there were a couple of ways they did it. Obviously everyone's seen pictures of Mustangs with drop tanks. They had the 75-gallon drop tanks, one on each wing, that they could punch off when they entered combat. That helped a lot. They also had the 106-gallon pressed paper tanks, and they had an even bigger metal drop tank later in the war. So that helped extend the range. The aircraft itself was pretty fuel efficient. I think I've got a pickup truck that gets less gas mileage than the Mustang. And they also got fuel into the aircraft in different places. So they had wing tanks like most aircraft do. But they also had a tank behind the pilot. They had a 75-gallon fuselage fuel tank, which was added somewhat near the end of P-51B development. And that tank really helped them get that extra mileage. The challenge of that arrangement is that you had to manage the fuel very, very carefully. That tank behind you took the center of gravity and made all kinds of weird things happen with it. Especially in some of the early test models, they didn't have baffles in that tank. So when people were doing aerobatics, the fuel's sort of sloshing around. And as you enter a loop, as you get to the top, the center of gravity has changed from when you entered the loop. Imagine that. And it caused problems in even the field after they put the baffles in. A lot of planes in training, especially, would go into flat spins and crash, and pilots would be killed because they had not sufficiently drained the tanks. So the whole process was taxi out under fuel from the tank. When you take off, you start switching fuel selection around, but you want to burn off your fuselage fuel first, then your drop tanks, and then try to get home with fuel in the wing tanks, and you keep like a 20-gallon reserve in that tank behind you. It posed a little more complexity on the pilots, but at the same token, it extended that range way out. And by the end of the war, they were ranging well into Poland.
I presume you're doing that because the tanks must affect the performance of the plane. So you probably want to get rid of the drop tanks first, because if you're flying aerobatics, they're presumably you're a drag.
Yeah, absolutely. The tanks come off as soon as you see the other side. Enemy aircraft, the tanks come off. And there's some cases. There's a case in one of the books I read about the 357th Fighter Group where they were engaging some fighters over Bucharest, and Kid Hofer, the famous ace of the fourth, his wingman's tanks wouldn't jettison, and that guy was rapidly shot down. He survived, and that freed up Kid Hofer to go do whatever he wanted to do. And he took off, and that was his final mission. Nobody knew what happened to him until I think the early 2000s, when it was figured out he was shot down attacking an airfield by himself in Mostar, pretty far away from Bucharest. But the tanks had to come off. That was exactly the same thing as hanging a big cannon under the wing of a 109, right? It was a great big draggy thing, and if only one of them came off, you were in really bad shape, because then you're fighting an airplane that doesn't want to fly straight.
I wonder if there's a certain part of Northeast Europe that they knew that you hit a certain point, and that there's a band across Europe that's just littered with drop tanks. It's not been attacked, but there's just empty tanks falling from the sky. Oh yeah, the
Luftwaffe, I think, had a reward for them. They paid us a small reward to bring them in because they could recycle them.
What are they? For some reason, I thought they were made of paper mache. I don't know why. What were they made of?
Some of them were aluminum. The ones are provided by North American, and then the paper, the impressed or the impregnated paper ones, the 100-gallon ones. And it was funny because part of the reason for those paper tanks was because we caught on the fact that the Germans were using our drop tanks against us. So
it's weird. You're making them all of aluminium and dropping them. It's quite a precious. It's relatively precious metal to be, as I say, littering wherever this band is across the German border, where they all get dropped. Hundreds of them must just come off.
Well, the other flip side of that, and I know when I wrote about the 332nd Fighter Group, there was one guy who was killed because somebody dropped their tanks above him, and the tank scored a direct hit on his cockpit. So it's kind of amazing, these giant, teardrop-shaped gas cans hurling out of the sky. I can only imagine some poor German farmer plowing his field, and these things come raining down.
Now, it's still a relatively, big. It's first deployed at big week. And throughout 43, 44, they're coming on stream. Did it have a lot of teething problems, or is it one of those planes that just arrives and works?
Yeah, it was obviously they needed it right away, and so when it showed up, it did have some problems with it. And so there was a whole litany of things that were kind of annoying issues that people dealt with in the field. So like the prop seal tended to throw oil directly onto your windshield. When you dove, the windscreen would fog up. The defogging, there wasn't a really good defogging system in place because it had been a low altitude aircraft. Didn't have a problem. Didn't have a need for that. The birdcage, the birdcage style canopy, it's sort of the top popped open and the side folded down, and there were frames, plenty of frames to look through, much like the 109 actually. The visibility not great, but those were things were easy to fix. The framing issue, if you really wanted to press it. The RAF had already fixed that issue. They had worked with North American to design a blown hood that Malcolm had made in the manufacturer in the UK. The Malcolm hood, the blown canopy, took care of that visibility problem. And it made it really easy to bail out, too. If you got in trouble, you just push the thing back and jump out. The other things were much more serious. So there were a series of aircraft that sort of disappeared on missions, and nobody could really account for them. And then James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group was flying a practice mission with his flight, and he saw another group practicing air combat maneuvers when one of them, the engine suddenly just snapped off and the airplane disintegrated and crashed into the ground. Well, what had happened was North American, when they built the Merlin engine mounts, the engine was basically connected to the aircraft by 4 bolts. And even in North American, they discovered the bolts they had initially used were metallurgically not sound, so they were prone to cracking. They put that message out as the first Mustangs came over. The Mustangs engine bolts were replaced by locally sourced bolts that North American thought were up to snuff, and they weren't. They were just as bad as the first batch of bolts. So there was about a 3-day period where the force was grounded, and a whole new bunch of bolts was cast in the UK, and fit to every single Mustang to keep the engine on. That's a pretty severe one. You don't want to lose the engine in flight. The other things were really fascinating. The tail, because of that extra throw on the rudder and the ailerons, could develop an aerodynamic flutter that could actually rip the tail clean off the aircraft. Pretty scary. So they developed a fix. They developed a kit they could send out in the field. A little fillet that came down from there's the tail. Well, there's a fillet like this that added surface area to the tail to maintain lateral stability, and that kind of eliminated the flutter. And they also included an adjustment to the trim tab mechanism that helped offset pressures automatically. And then the third thing that was a challenge was the landing gear doors. The uplocks weren't really great. They tended to fail and let the wheel covers drop down. When that happened, the air pressure across the wings could change so dramatically, so suddenly, it could actually rip the wing off the aircraft. I'd actually known about that because I got a flight in a Mustang a while back with a friend of a friend, and that was one of the things they were futzing around with before we went up, was making sure the uplock worked on the landing gear door, because it's like, yeah, you don't want that to drop down. That would be not good. So that was redesigned. Those things were all sort of sent back to North America, and they built them into future Mustangs. So as the P-51B production process went by, the planes that arrived were stronger and better and had less bugs. That kind of makes sense. The other thing that was always a problem for the P-51B was ammunition feed problems. So even the first, Glenn Eagleston almost had the first American Mustang kill, only got a probable because the gun stopped firing. It sounds crazy, but they mounted the machine guns in the wings at an angle because they had built the Mustang for a lot of different purposes, and they had requirements for different types of weapons: 20 millimeter guns or 20 millimeter cannons, 50 caliber machine guns, and then 30 caliber machine guns. And the best way to fit all those things in was to develop a mount that had some room for the guns to fit, and for the 50 calibers to get in there, they had to go in at an angle. And as a result, the ammunition feed had to come up and sort of make a kink to get into the receiver of the machine gun. So in high G maneuvers, and most air combat happens with high G maneuvers, that ammunition feed would kink. And the other problem was, even if you did get around to fire through the gun, sometimes the shell casing would come down, and under G would get jammed at the back end, and that would jam the gun too. And so how do they fix that? The guys on the ground in the UK, the American ground crews, figured out ways to scavenge parts from other airplanes, notably the turrets on B-26s, to invent a ratchet that would automatically yank the shell casings out of the bottom of the machine gun, and a solenoid and a motor to force feed the ammunition into the machine guns. They fixed this problem, and of course it took a while to get through all the Mustangs that were being deployed. But the good news is the depot system that was established in the UK was so effective that as the ones in the field were being fixed, the same modifications were being made to the new Mustangs that were being unpacked and being readied for action. So gradually, all these things were ironed out. So by the late spring, early summer of 1944, the P-51B had most of its bugs worked out. But as you can imagine, if you're a pilot taking this airplane into combat, there's a whole litany of things that could go amiss that you just have to accept. I mean, you couldn't even get into combat with a P-47 when the Mustang was fighting. So you took those things as sort of a given of being in that platform at the time.
Did the pilots like it? Was it easy to fly, or did it have its idiosyncrasies?
Every Mustang pilot I ever talked to loved that airplane. Period. End of story. And going back to look at the developmental history, the test pilots who flew the very early ones just raved about it. And if you look at what we were flying at the time, the P-47 is a good airplane. It's not a great climbing airplane. It was a great ground attack airplane. It's not as maneuverable and not as nimble as the Mustang. The P-38, kind of the same thing. Although P-38 pilots love the P-38 for sure. If you talk to them, nothing like having an airplane where you can have an engine failure and still come back home. But all the Mustang pilots, it's the Mustang is like strapping on the airplane and flying it like you're wearing it. It's a different animal altogether, and it could put you in places that you couldn't be otherwise in a fight. And I think things like its ability to use flaps to decrease its turning radius took a lot of pilots who were in bad initial positions and put them in good positions in the fight, or at least got them out of trouble. So yeah, the Mustang was kind of beloved. The issues with it were that fuselage fuel tank that could cause CG issues. Like a lot of American airplanes, a lot of airplanes during the war, sometimes the oxygen systems could fail and cause problems. So, but that was not unique to the Mustang. So it was pretty much beloved. I mean, I would assume if you're like Glenn Eggleston and you had a sure kill lined up on a BF-110 and you pull the trigger and the guns jam, you have a temporary beef with the airplane. But as it was being fixed, it was a great flying airplane. So I think as things were fixed, people became more and more in love with the Mustang. I love doing some research. John Dibbs was working with somebody to do a painting of the 4th Fighter Group going out on a mission. And this is in August of 1944. I happen to have all the records of all the missions, so I knew who was flying on what mission and in what airplane. And there was one mission that had the 2 airplanes that they needed to have in this picture. So they had all 16 of the Mustang and the squadron flying out. And this is August 44. 16 airplanes, 5 of them were still B models. So that tells you something about the airplane. People still liked the B model even after the D showed up.
By the end of 44, is the P-51B still the dominant model, or is it have they been sort of cycled out?
Yeah, as 45 rolled around, it was primarily the D, but mostly it was because the Bs just were being worn out. A lot of them were really heavily used. You know, the first batch of Bs went to the 354th. They were the only group that had the Mustang for December and January 44. So they flew almost every mission into Germany. And then the 4th Fighter Group rolled around with some and went from there. The action around D-Day was very extensive, and a lot of times the Mustangs were being pressed into ground attack missions, which was not its real forte. If you look at some of the histories of those groups that are so well known for their high score, the 4th Fighter Group or the 352nd or 357th, the period around D-Day is brutal because they lose lots of Mustangs attacking ground targets in support of the invasion. So and as a result, the Bs were attrited away generally, slowly but surely. But the B model was still pretty prominent in the Mediterranean theater. It was very prominent in the China, Burma, India theater. You know, it played a role all the way to the end of the war, which is, it shows it was a sound design.
Was there a big difference between the B and the D?
Yeah, there was some small. Obviously, you've got the canopy change, and the canopy visibility was sort of night and day. I mean, the D model, the sill is about right here on your shoulder, and it feels like you're out there floating in the air. I've flown in a Mustang, so I can speak from firsthand experience. It's like you're just sort of out there on your own, like Superman. So the visibility is phenomenal. The visibility issue with the B model completely gone. The D model had 650 caliber machine guns, and versus the 4 in the B model, and they were upright, straight. No ammunition feed problems with the D model. So that was a big plus, and small tweaks around the engine and some other things like that. And they made some changes to make it more easily manufactured. So the D was the industrial, the industrial version of the B. The B was still somewhat I don't want to say it was like a prototype, but they were still learning a lot as they were making the Bs, and the D really capitalized on all of that. And if you're a real Mustang nut, you know that there's after that there's the lightweight P-51H, which looks really weird. It's got different proportions to make it lighter, and then the XP-82 twin Mustang, which is truly a horse of a different color. It's really a interesting and cool airplane, but they really kept stretching the Mustang design. The D was kind of almost the halfway point in its development.
When did the American Air Force phase it out? How long of a life did it have?
Yeah, it lasted a long time. It fought in the Korean War. The D model Mustangs fought in the Korean War. They did a lot of ground attack work until they were replaced by jets. In Korea, they were very vulnerable flying at low altitude. They were not in the right envelope for that aircraft. That said, the Mustang stayed around in secondary air forces for a long time. I think the Dominican Republic phased theirs out in like 1979 or 1980. It's an amazing airplane, and part of that is because the Merlin engine was so efficient and so easily maintained, and part of it was because the airframe itself was so well put together that it could stretch and keep evolving.
It's amazing that they were still in service that late. That seems like a good place to finish. Chris, thanks as ever. It was a pleasure to chat with you. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about the Mustang, Chris's book is One of Those Small Ospreys, P-51 B/C Mustang, Northwest Europe 1943-44. I will put a link on the website, ww2podcast.com. If you have enjoyed this episode of the show, why not consider becoming a patron? And you can find out more at patreon.com/ww2podcast. For patrons, Patreon will give you a custom RSS feed you can use with your podcast software, which will give you access to extra World War II chat and advert-free episodes, and they'll magically appear on your device. So that's patreon.com/ww2podcast. Well, that is all from me for now. Next time, I hope we'll be discussing the Italian General Rodolfo Graziani. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.